I am the way into the doleful city. I am the way into eternal grief. I am the way to a forsaken race. Justice it was that moved my great creator. Divine omnipotence created me, and highest wisdom joined with primal love. Before me, nothing but eternal things were made, and I shall last eternally. Abandon every hope, all you who enter. I saw these words spelled out in somber colors inscribed along the ledge above a gate. Master, I said, these words I see are cruel.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And it's great to have you here as we start discussing the theme of evil, because this time we're going to be looking at Dante's Inferno.
Yeah, and I've been thinking about this theme over the last little while. I think that the three books we're doing all are really concerned with evil, but they're also concerned with a lot of the same things in other ways as well, like with creation and sense of self. There's a lot of issues, I think, that are going to connect these three.
Yeah. Last episode, we were looking at Gertrude Stein's autobiography of Alice B. Toklas, which both of us felt a little trepidation going into because, despite how much we loved it, we never really talked about Stein's work in this way before. This time we have the opposite problem.
Yeah, with Stein, there was a sense that we both knew the text well in the sense that we both really liked it and we thought about it, but neither of us had ever taught it or had learned about it in a course or anything like that. So our sense of it was really different. Here with Dante, this is a text that we know kind of inside and out. At least I feel that way about it, and I think you have some of the same sense.
I'm sure I don't know it as well as you do, but yeah, I've definitely read it many times in many different translations, in many different contexts, both for fun on my own and then in classes as a student and then in classes teaching it. And you were saying that you've been reading this for many, many years now.
Yeah. And actually, when I say I know it inside now, I don't mean to say I feel like I know everything about it. Like I'm very aware there's a ton of things I don't know about it. But what I mean is that I've kind of grown up with it. The first time I read Dante's Inferno, I was a teenager. It was actually the same year I read Gertrude Stein for the first time. So I had that moment of discovery was the same period. And then had to reread it in connection with courses that I was doing in graduate school, read it in connection with research I was doing first on optics and later on depictions of Islam, had to read it when I was teaching graduate courses that involved it. And just so in so many different contexts. So I feel like I've known it over a long period of time. And it's kind of grown with me, or my sense of it has grown with me. So it's a strange kind of relationship.
Yeah, like so many great books, it's just a bottomless well of reading and finding new things to read it. And of course, there's a whole academic industry around reading the Divine Comedy.
Yeah.
Commenting on it.
Yeah. And it's interesting to think about what kind of place it has when people think about, important books, great books, right? So in Italy, in complicated ways, it's been central to, I think you could say, like national identity, ways of conceiving of the nation, right? From the 19th century onward and earlier too, in different kinds of ways. Like it functions in some ways like Shakespeare functions for people in English-speaking environments, right? So there's that weird kind of status. But here too, like nowadays, when you think about literature classrooms where people are doing courses in world literature, one of the things I've noticed is that when you do feedback, because I work on the Norton anthology, right? When you do feedback from students and instructors and you find out what worked well, what worked less well, what do they want more of, they're always like, give us more Dante. They're always insatiable. And you got to wonder, like, what is that about? Why is there such an appetite? And then beyond that, you were talking a moment ago about how we're foregrounding evil. And, that makes me think about how with Dante, we're going to talk about the Inferno, but the Inferno is only the first part of a 3-part work, the Divine Comedy. But that's the one that people come to. And I don't think it's just because it's first. I think it's opens itself up to people, and maybe it's evil that opens itself up.
It's certainly more graphic, more vivid, yeah. More obviously engaging in that way, in the way that horror movies might be. I don't know, that you're seeing these very visceral images.
Yeah.
And these outlandish sometimes images. Is it your favorite part of the Commedia?
Well, I think it's the most accessible. It's, as you say, it's vivid. And there are certain moments in there that I really do love. I think they're like, they press your emotional buttons no matter how many times you've read them. A couple of them include moments we'll look at, like when he meets his old teacher, Brunetto Latini, or when we're on the very bottom of hell and we encounter Ugolino talking about his experiences before his death. Like that, for me, those still push my emotional buttons no matter how many times I read them. Increasingly, I find more interesting the other parts of the Divine Comedy, the Purgatorio and the Paradiso. But I don't feel real emotional when I read those. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Oh, what a neat idea. What a fascinating way of configuring the afterlife. But I don't feel things. And I think maybe that's part of the reason why readers continue to be drawn to the Inferno.
It's interesting because Purgatory has always been my favorite part.
It's so interesting.
It's super interesting, but I also find it the most emotionally compelling.
Yeah.
In a weird way, I kind of bounce off a lot of the Inferno. There's a lot of spectacle, but I just don't get engaged with it the way that I engage with the sort of psychological struggles that the characters in Purgatory are going through. Although I guess we'll get to that when we get around to talking about Purgatory someday.
Yeah, we definitely should. Actually, I would love to do that.
But before we start getting into the nitty-gritty, we should talk a little bit about the translations that we're using. You've chosen the Mark Musa translation that Penguin has put out.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that a little bit more. It is a really solid translation. It's easily accessible, but there's also an online translation that's on the Digital Dante site that we'll include a link to that has Mandelbaum's translation on there, which is also absolutely solid. So that's probably the easiest one for first-time readers of Dante to get hold of. My actual favorite translation, and this is probably just from my personal experience, is the one that Singleton did back in the 1970s, Charles Singleton. It's a prose translation. It's extremely literal, and it's printed in a facing page where you have the Italian text on the left and the English translation on the right. And for me, it's probably emotional because that was the first one I read. And he was, I had him in class, like he was still lecturing. He was like ancient. I think it was one of the last 2 years he taught. And it was a very idiosyncratic kind of class experience. We only got like about 20 cantos in. I mean, he never made it to the end because, but it was compelling to listen to him. And so maybe that's one of the reasons that translation sticks in my mind. And you've got another translation as well, right?
Yeah, I have looked at a translation by Kieran Carson. It's a really interesting translation that was done in the early 2000s by a Northern Irish poet and novelist. And it's particularly interesting because it's trying to use a lot of what we might consider anachronistic language that comes out of ballad traditions from Ireland from 17th, 18th century, maybe 19th as well. There are a lot of striking choices in there. He's trying to make it a very compelling text on its own rather than a necessarily fully literal accurate text in that sense. So he's willing to introduce connections and ideas that are maybe not present in the original Italian, but make for a very compelling read. So a lot of the time, if you're an undergrad taking a course and being introduced to Dante, the lecture that accompanies it will tell you far too much about 13th century Florentine politics.
Yeah.
So let's give a little background on Dante without giving that much unnecessary detail.
Yeah. I noticed a tiny bit about Dante. I mean, Dante's dates are 1265 to 1321, and I only remember those because I was also born in a 65 year, and because there's such a beautiful numerological symmetry about his date of his death, 1321, because the numbers game is a big thing in the Divine Comedy in ways we might talk about later. He was politically very involved, and Florence was basically a sort of political cesspit in his time. He was involved in political office, and he ends up being exiled from Florence. And that's worth mentioning because he's deeply bitter about that whole situation, and you feel it powerfully in the Inferno. He loves that city, and he hates that city for having kind of turned its back on him. He writes other things besides the Divine Comedy, though that's the work we know him for best. That's the thing he writes while he's in exile, and he alludes to that experience of exile a number of times in the poem. He also writes a political work late in life, the Monarchia. He writes individual lyric poems that when he's in his late 20s, he gathers together into a volume that he calls the Vita Nova, the New Life. And that whole phase of his early life also gets echoed in the Inferno in particular. He's got a relationship with like his bros, like his fellow poets. And above all, like the one above all of them is the person he calls his first friend, his like top of the line friend, Guido Cavalcante, who was also an amazing poet. And he actually runs into Guido's father in hell. So there's all kinds of autobiographical echoes that show up in the Inferno. That it's kind of neat to reflect on his life in that context. He's writing the Divine Comedy up until his death. And in fact, there's a kind of story that gets told, it's probably apocryphal, that everybody thought he hadn't quite finished the last part, the Paradiso, and then they found the last few cantos of it like tucked in the wall by where his deathbed was, right? So it's probably a made up story, but it gives you a sense of how much his autobiography is kind of tied up with his literary production.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's most important about this idea of the Florentine politics that he was embroiled in is that he encounters quite a lot of people on both sides of that debate, people he was allied with, people he was fighting against, people who done him bad.
Mm-hmm.
And he puts them in hell or elsewhere, but he puts them in hell. If you read this, you keep encountering these people and you keep seeing footnotes
Mm-hmm.
that tell you what the relationship is. for the casual reader, that's not super important to figure out what the details are.
Yeah, it's one of the fascinating things here, right? Is that so we're like as we go through the stages of hell, deeper and deeper into the abyss, people are being punished for the things they've done wrong. And sometimes we encounter figures that we know about, like they're kind of famous figures from myth, like characters like Ulysses, or some of the figures from Ovid's myth, like Murrah, we'll find there in the Inferno too. So everybody kind of knows who those are, right? But you also find like somebody that Dante knew because he was a terrible businessman, or some guy who was an alchemist or whatever. And we would never recognize those names, except for the fact that people were commenting on and giving notes to Dante, like almost as soon as he died. Like the first commentaries on the Divine Comedy appear within a couple of decades of his death.
Yeah, this was a very popular text immediately.
And like writers that we look at are really deeply interested in Dante. So for example, we talked about Christine de Pizan's City of Ladies. She's clearly really interested in Dante. And one of her other works, she directly quotes from the Inferno and imitates it in all kinds of interesting ways. And when we look at Milton's Paradise Lost next week, he is also obviously deeply interested in Dante's hell.
Well, let's look really quickly at the structure of the Commedia.
How many parts is the Divine Comedy in? Like there's like a million correct answers to this, right?
Right.
So 3, 100, depending on how you look at it, right?
It's in 3 major sections: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. So hell, purgatory, and paradise. It is in 100 cantos. 100 doesn't divide evenly into 3. So there's an extra canto in Inferno, which is probably Canto 1, which takes place before he's properly on the journey.
Yeah, people love to write this out as 1 plus 33 plus 33 plus 33, right? Again, it's that kind of numbers game where you find meaning in number. And that's something Dante, like a number of other medieval writers, this is something they like to do, sort of bring out the way in which form and number convey meaning in a way that's sort of universally understandable.
Similarly, the poetic structure are in these 3-line tercets, these 3-line stanzas, each of which has 11 syllables, as I recall.
Yeah, and it's an incredibly intricate rhyme scheme that is, I was going to say, not super hard in Italian. It's actually still super hard in Italian, but you can do it in Italian. Any other language you try to do it in, as far as I know, sounds terrible. So one of the translations that some people may have run across of the Divine Comedy, Dorothy Sayers, she tries to do it. It's just awful. I mean, she's a brilliant writer. Her Peter Wimsey novels are incredible. They're fabulous. They're like wonderful novels. But her Terzarima is truly abominable.
The Kieran Carson is in Terzarima.
Oh, wow, really?
He does this by having incredibly slant rhymes. In other words, imperfect rhymes, some of which are really reaches, but which work.
It's neat that he can do it at all.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty successful overall in it. But there we also find another set of 3s, right? This idea of 3s and these rhymes that braid in with each other to show how interconnected each line is in each stanza is with the next.
Yeah, people often say that he does it that way in order to make it impossible to change his poem. In other words, it's like making something so intricate that if somebody were to try to patch something else in, it would show. So I don't know, that's probably an apocryphal view, but it tells you something about the very tightly knitted nature of this poem, right? Because it is a poem. Nowadays, when we think about poems, we think of lyric poems, right? Like something that takes up a page or a couple of pages at the most. But, when Dante's writing this idea of narrative poetry, like poems that are hundreds and hundreds of pages long, this is a normal thing for them. So it's, it's in 3 parts, it's in 100 parts, but it's also one thing in a very powerful sense. Like it's very unified also, which is weird.
So let's walk our way through the text like Dante does, and along the way, we'll take note of anything interesting that we see.
Because that's like what Dante does. And when you say Dante goes through the text, like he totally does, but how can I put it? He's not moving on his own power, especially at certain moments, right? Because he's got a guide. And they move through this landscape, this often treacherous and difficult to cross landscape. And then they stop off to see things, or sometimes they're invited to stop by the people they see.
So we begin. It's Maundy Thursday in the year 1300. This is a few years before Dante's exile, but nevertheless, you can still see it coming.
Well, that's because, right, he writes, like, how can I put it? The apparent date where everything is happening is Maundy Thursday. You have to explain what Maundy Thursday is. What is that?
That is the Thursday before Easter.
Right, exactly. So right before Good Friday, which is for the Christian calendar is like the most important weekend ever, right? So it's that day in the year 1300, but he's actually writing it several years later. And so as a result, he can prophesy events in this poem with confidence, right? Because these are events that by the time he's writing have already happened. But in the fictional date of composition, they're still on the horizon.
Yeah, the spirits he encounters in the underworld don't know what's happening right now, but do have a sense of what's going to happen in the next few years, which is a very interesting science fiction type technique to allow this temporal play. But He's 35 years old. He's halfway through his expected life. That's part of the famous opening lines. How does Musa translate the first three lines?
He does it, midway along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off from the straight path, which is pretty literal.
Yeah. As he's wandered off the path, he encounters three animals, because everything's in threes. He encounters a leopard, a lion, and a wolf, which is a biblical allusion. And he can't seem to escape them, but somebody comes to his aid.
Vergil. And we haven't talked about Vergil's Aeneid, but that is a text I would love to talk about. It's a text from the ancient world. It's about a voyage. It connects to the Troy story that we talked about when we read Homer. And for Dante, Vergil is super important, partly because he's also a writer, and Dante's going to have a certain level of kinship with him because of that. But he's also got a kind of emotional or affective relationship with Vergil, because Vergil's Aeneid was a school text. It's something that you would study when you were first mastering Latin as a child. And so Dante's knowledge of Vergil is both intellectual and also kind of heartfelt. And you see that relationship between the two of them as they move through the underworld. He refers to Vergil at one point saying, you my teacher, you my leader, you my guide. And then there are other moments where he's clearly looking to Vergil for help in ways that are almost like a child looking to its mother.
The other aspect of that, of course, is that in the Aeneid, Aeneas spends one section of the text going into the underworld and meeting people who prophesy about the future of Rome. So Vergil is a reasonable guide.
He's been there before.
He's taken us through it before, yes. Vergil eventually guides him to the gates of hell in the evening. This is the Middle Ages, so the next day starts in the evening. So now it is Good Friday as they actually enter hell. We go in and we encounter a group of people who are the uncommitted.
Hell is a very, very organized place for Dante, right? It's like a well-oiled machine. And so people are organized according to their level of badness. And we'll see how that plays out as you get further into the underworld. But when you're right at the threshold of the underworld, you get the people who are not quite bad enough to be in hell, but they're not quite good enough not to be in hell. They're truly in this in-between kind of place. And there's even more than one kind of in-between place, as we'll see.
Yeah, these are the people whose lives were too boring to place them.
So he doesn't name any of them.
He doesn't name any of them. These are the people that you cannot remember, according to Dante.
They're not real good, not real bad.
And so they're just stuck there.
There's a neat thing that Dante says about this. He's kind of puzzled by what he's seeing. Like, what is this? And Vergil says, these are the ones who live with no blame and no praise. They're mixed in with that repulsive choir of angels, neither faithful nor unfaithful to their God, who undecided stood but for themselves. And that's something that Milton's going to find super interesting, as we'll see next time.
Exactly. That section popped out to me in a way that I hadn't in previous readings, because Dante is so disgusted by these people who have lived normal lives, not really concerning themselves one way or the other.
He has way more respect for really bad people.
Yeah. The worst thing for him is to be
incompetently bad
and just normal or average or not invested in this epic battle. The next stop is the first proper circle of hell, which is Limbo.
Which is, again, a threshold or a border, right? It's also an in-between place in a certain sense, because these people are not suffering.
Yeah, it's another sort of holding place for people who don't quite fit into the system as it is now.
It looks pretty good.
It looks fine. You're hanging out with the unbaptized and with the virtuous pagans. And we see several familiar faces there.
Yeah, there's a bunch of philosophers, including Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. There's really important rulers and kings, people like Saladin and other kinds of rulers who have really been outstanding. And there's poets.
We see Homer, we see Ovid, all sorts of people we've looked at before.
Exactly. And of course, this is where Vergil normally hangs out. So he's sort of passing by his apartment, as it were, as they're heading down into the depths of hell. And so the other poets are really happy to see him.
So Vergil dies in 19 BCE, just before Christ even is born. So he has no chance to find out about this. He has no chance to be baptized.
Yeah, he's shut out from Christian salvation, right?
Right. But he was still a pretty good guy, obviously. According to this anyways. And so he gets to hang out in this section. Yeah,
and it's beautiful, like green meadows. There's like a castle kind of structure. It's a beautiful environment, but it's technically still hell. So they're cut off, but they're not suffering. So it's this really like layered sense of what kinds of things are possible in this underworld. And there's this incredibly sort of egomaniacal moment that happens in that passage about Limbo, where Vergil is explaining who all is there. He says, oh, there's Homer, there's Ovid, there's these others. He says, since they all share one name with me, the name you heard resounding in that single voice, and here he means the name of poet, right? They honor me. And Dante thinks to himself, so I saw gathered there the noble school of these poets. And he says, after they had talked a while together, they turned and with a gesture welcomed me. And at that sign, I saw my master smile. So basically it's like, and I hung with the big guys.
To a certain extent, that is
It's
one way of looking at the entire Commedia.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, because he's inventing a self, right? This is a poem that's really interested in autobiography. Dante will tell us about himself and how much he hates Florence and loves Florence, and he'll encounter people he's known intimately, people he's known from a distance. But it's also about inventing a self, inventing a poetic self, and this is one of those moments where he's really doing it.
It's in that way, it is very similar to the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas.
For sure.
It's an author inventing a history of themselves that puts them in the best possible light, that associates them with great geniuses.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't a lot of other parallels between the two texts.
No, but that's absolutely right. The self-invention is absolutely, in some really powerful ways, parallel.
So we leave the pleasant fields of Limbo.
And get to the circle of lust.
And we get to some proper circles with proper sins attached to them.
Where people are suffering.
Yes. Exactly. And the first circle is, as you say, lust. And we have a famous encounter here with Paolo and Francesca. Francesca da Rimini, these are based on real people.
These are real people, yeah.
She fell in love with her husband's brother, Paolo Malatesta, and they tell a story. And Dante is excited to hear their love story because he is still that lyric poet who wants to sing of love at this point in the story.
Yeah. And so like on the one hand, this is a really romantic story. We have to assume that it's current in Dante's day, right? His readers are going to be familiar with this story, right? And you were saying they tell him their story, but in fact, only one of them, Francesca, speaks. And there's a kind of a lot of emphasis on the fact that there's only one of them who's able to speak. The other one is sort of incapable of it. And also they speak, but they're also suffering. In each circle of hell, we'll find people suffering in different ways. And the way they suffer corresponds to their sin. So here, the shades or spirits are tossed about in these tumultuous winds, almost like birds would be tossed about. And the idea is that in the same way that when you're experiencing lust, you're kind of tossed about by your emotions. You can't steer yourself on the right course. What they're suffering is a kind of reflection of what they did wrong, right? And each time we'll see that over and over again. And Francesca talks about how this happened. She tells their story. And of course, when you tell your own story, how can I put it? You tend to put yourself in a good light.
Yes.
So this story is compelling. So she says to Dante, she says, if your great desire is to learn the very root of such a love as ours, I shall tell you, but in words of flowing tears. One day we read to pass the time away of Lancelot, how he fell in love. We were alone, innocent of suspicion. Time and again our eyes were brought together by the book we read, our faces flushed and paled, to the moment of one line alone we yielded. It was when we read about those longed-for lips now being kissed by such a famous lover that this one, who shall never leave my side, then kissed my mouth and trembled as he did. That day we read no further. And so Dante predictably is like, oh my God, that's so sad, right? And Vergil will be, a little annoyed with him because you're not supposed to feel bad for people in hell. And this is a lesson that Dante will take a while to learn, but he will learn it. So let me ask you, do you like that passage? That is a famous passage, often commented on, often depicted. And it is interesting in certain ways. What do you think about it?
It's hard to say because I'm so familiar with what I think is the main way of reading that.
Yeah.
This interest in Dante's
response,
his over empathy. I've read the Vita Nuova. I've read his book of love poems. This does seem like that same poet from his early work. That same poet who's very invested in this idea of I don't want to quite say courtly love, but something along those lines.
Well, who's immature in a certain way. I mean, this is a very immature Dante who's listening to this story, right?
That's certainly how we're supposed to read it. You can have your own sense of what counts as mature if you agree with the ethics and morals that the Commedia is putting forward. But yeah, that is absolutely how it's read. Yeah.
Well, in terms of those ethics and morals, right? Remember in the opening passage that we did, the cold open, that's the gate of hell. Right? Remember, Dante's all freaked out when he sees it. And it's describing hell, abandon all hope when you enter here. What made hell? Justice and love. And every time I read that, no matter how many times I read it, I'm like, sort of? In what kind of universe is the place of punishment coming from love?
Right.
I mean, it makes me think about like Orwell's 1984 or something. Like, how do you make that make sense? And Dante's reaction to what he sees in the underworld is all about that, learning to understand suffering as divine love. And that's very creepy.
Especially as the suffering gets more and more intense and visceral as we go further and further into hell. It can be very difficult for a reader to accept that understanding of it. Mm-hmm. Like, I think it's fairly easy to figure out a way of understanding Paolo and Francesca's story as a kind of perversion of love.
Yeah.
Especially because they are, it was just a fling. Or maybe it was.
Well, Francesca represented it as not purposeful, as accidental. It was the book that brought them together. It wasn't that they meant to do it.
Yeah, she's not taking any responsibility for her
not
actions.
at all, no.
And he's just weeping the whole time.
He can't speak.
Which there is no explanation given for that.
No, we're invited to invent that for ourselves. Is it shame? Is it sorrow? Is it a kind of powerlessness and weakness of will? We don't know.
Does he just not like her?
Oh, surely not. He won't leave her side.
He can't. He doesn't get to choose where he ends up.
But so we get farther down into the underworld, right?
So we go through several circles. We go through the third circle of gluttony, the fourth circle of greed, where we have people who are both greedy and also miserly, like they're immoderate. We enter the fifth circle of wrath, which always makes me think of the Iliad. And here we have an encounter which I think is one of the next steps of Dante's education of how he should respond to people. So he encounters Filippo Argenti, which is one of these people from Florentine politics that he quarreled with and did him bad.
And he's not so sympathetic this time.
No, once he figures out who Filippo Argenti is, he starts yelling at him. May you weep and wail stuck here in this place forever, you damned soul. For filthy as you are, I recognize you. And a little while later, as they're about to leave, he says to Vergil, Master, it would certainly make me happy to see him dunked deep into this slop just once before we leave this lake. It truly would. And he to me, before the other shore comes into sight, you will be satisfied. A wish like that is worthy of fulfillment.
Yeah, so Filippo here is going to suffer more because Dante said that would be a really good thing to see. Vergil's like, good job, Dante.
Right, but there's also a sense that maybe Dante's not fully understanding it yet because Dante is invested with all this personal animus against Filippo, which happens to coincide with justice as it's understood in this system.
Right.
But Dante is not yet able to see justice from an impersonal perspective, from a divine perspective.
Yeah, by the time he gets into the lower parts of hell, he'll start lining up his own point of view better. I want to say better because it's so awful, but more effectively.
Better in terms of what this narrative seems to be implying. So it's this interesting moment of growth. Like you get the sense that Dante would not feel that way about any of the other people who are stuck in this part of hell. But,
it's personal for him.
And Vergil is going to use that personal aspect of it in order to help teach Dante how to appropriately discern and deal out justice. So after this encounter, we break this cycle of one canto, one section per circle of hell.
Yeah, it sort of widens out, like it gets it lingers.
Yeah. We approach the city of Dis. It's guarded by fallen angels and he gets threatened, but then an angel comes down from heaven to let them through, which is an interesting moment. It's one of the first proper roadblocks that they've encountered. They've had to argue with some of the ferry people to get them across rivers, but now, you get these more narrative moments almost. Well,
you get an increasingly strong sense of landscape. Sometimes it's easy to move through that landscape. Sometimes it's very difficult. Sometimes it's beautiful, like what we saw in Limbo. Sometimes it's caverns or steep drops that they have to try to navigate.
We are going to go through the sixth circle of heretics.
Where Dante's going to run into his old beloved friend Guido's father, Cavalcante de Cavalcante. The heretics are in a particularly striking landscape. Do you remember where they are physically? They're in the open tombs.
Oh, right.
I always find that super creepy.
And then they take a moment to look at the lower parts of hell. They stop, they look at it, they have a discussion about how it's been laid out. They talk about Aristotle for a while. It's yet another moment where we get a sense of an interest in this layout, this organizational schema.
Like the system of hell.
Yeah. One of the interesting things is that this is now how most people think hell is laid out.
I know. People think this is like real.
Yeah, the nine circles of hell is somehow Catholic dogma or Christian dogma, which it isn't. It wasn't. This is all invented by Dante. He may have taken inspiration from other texts for ways of thinking about how you might lay out this kind of space, but it's not. It's just not.
But it goes to show you how, the truth claims of this text, like he's always making this claim that this is real, I saw this. And the fact that he uses historical figures, things that actually happened, people from Florence that his readers would know, other major figures in history like kings and rulers and philosophers and so on, it makes you feel like it could be real. And I think even now in the 21st century, like when you think about the students' appetite for this in class, I think they're still compelled by those truth claims, even if they intellectually know this is a fiction. It's hard to believe that with your guts.
I had to remind students that this was all made up, that Dante placed these people in hell, that he didn't actually go, like they knew he didn't go on this trip, but the fact that these people were in hell still somehow registered for some of them as real. And the idea that hell is actually laid out like this seemed real to them in a way that...
Is it like historical fiction?
Yeah, it's just, it resonates so highly with how we think of it, because how we think of the layout of hell is based on this text.
And this idea of suffering that matches your sin, right? What you've done wrong is somehow visited on you. This is not an idea that Dante invents. He adapts it from elsewhere, but he really elaborates it into a whole system of what's called the contrapasso, the thing that is done to you that matches what you did. It's sort of like a reflection of your bad thing that captures people's imaginations, I think, in a powerful way.
It's very hard for us to read this text now and to see this organizational structure and that system of retribution as new, as something that is been invented and presented to us as an interesting thought experiment, or as a way of understanding the world that might be a bit different for us, which I imagine it must have been for his first audiences.
Well, it's new and it's not new, right? So there's this thing, the lex talionis, right? This sort of, this idea that comes from the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, this idea of retributive justice. So the way that justice is served is by something that corresponds to the transgression, right? So there's a sense in which it's a really old idea. But the way that for Dante, it's folded out in a very elaborate way, in a very vivid and embodied way. Like it's played out on your body. Like it's not just played out, it's played out on your body in some way. And remember, these are spirits or souls in hell. Like they don't have bodies, but they feel like they have bodies because we see them being cut into pieces. We see them being boiled in pitch. We see them being tossed about on the wind. So they're as if bodies, you might say.
Yeah, no, they definitely seem to feel the pain of having a body, even if they don't actually have one.
And they look like it. There'll be these moments where Dante will describe what the burned skin looks like, or what a body that's sort of sliced in half looks like with its guts half hanging out. So when I say vivid, I mean it looks like bodies.
But they can immediately tell that Dante, who is traveling as a fully
they're like, what are you doing
person,
here?
Yeah, they immediately know that he's not dead.
They're completely freaked out by this, right? Who are you who comes through here? Why are you so special? I mean, that's the implicit question, which of course Dante just loves. Because
yes, he does.
He's like, I am special.
Yeah, he's a special boy. So we carry on. We get into the 7th circle, which is for the violent. This is the first one that is subdivided. We've got 3 different rings, and this is going to become more and more of a feature as we go down. Like these subdivisions keep multiplying. Yeah,
it's very Aristotelian, right? It's very organized. It's a real system of punishment. So different flavors of violence, right? Violence against others, violence against yourself, violence against God, which is the worst of all.
It is, but in addition to being Aristotelian, there's also this sense of it dilating. Like I think he mentions early on that there are 9 circles. And if you're expecting 1 circle per canto as the rhythm that you get set up early on, that gets disrupted.
Oh, yeah.
And then it gets disrupted again when you start hitting these subdivisions. And then it's going to get disrupted further. And even though everything is organized, it's sort of out of joint. It's a disorganized organization, or it's one that doesn't feel mathematically perfect.
I always get the sense of it kind of expanding and contracting, kind of. It's a very weird feeling. Like it's, when you say it's like ordered and disordered, I feel like it's like disproportionate. It's almost like it's hallucinogenic almost in a way.
And one of the dilatory effects is that even though you think you're getting close to the end of it, you're not. Like it just takes longer and longer. The closer you get to it, the longer it's going to take to get through all this.
Yeah, the more subdivided. Yeah.
It's an interesting literary effect. So we've encountered several circles of the violent, the people who are violent against their neighbors, which include Alexander the Great and Attila. People who are violent against themselves, which is a very interesting section. It's the wood of the suicides.
Yeah. And their embodiment is very strange, right? Because unlike other figures where we see them tossed on the wind or boiled in pitch or cut in half, like what do their bodies look like? They're bramble bushes. It's a very strange, bizarre kind of passage. They kind of have bodies and don't have bodies because they threw their bodies away.
Right. So the understanding is that when final judgment comes, most people will get their bodies back, but they won't. They'll stay as brambles with their bodies hanging off of them, which is a very upsetting image.
Yeah, it's awful.
We then follow up that space with people who are violent against, it's subdivided more. We've got people who are violent against God, then against art, and then against nature. They're all in the same ring, but there's 3 different parts of the ring with different landscapes. So amongst the people that we meet here on this plain of burning sand is Brunetto Latini, who's an old friend of Dante's.
Well, he's his teacher, which is for Dante is an even more intimate relation in some ways. Remember we said before how his feelings about Vergil, like he sees Vergil as his teacher and he looks up to Vergil and he kind of looks up to Brunetto Latini too. And it's such a moving passage, I think. I'm just going to read a few lines of it. Dante and Vergil are in this part of the underworld where it's burning sand. And so as a result, the souls that are being punished down there have to keep running, right? Because otherwise they're going to burn on the sand. And as they're going by, a little bunch of them are going by, one of them recognizes Dante. And so this is what Dante says. He says, I was recognized by one of them who grabbed my garment's hem and shouted, how marvelous! And I, when he reached out his arm towards me, straining my eyes, saw through his face's crust, through his burned features that could not prevent my memory from bringing back his name. And bending my face down to meet with his, I said, is this really you here, Ser Brunetto? I just find that, I mean, like I said, no matter how many times I read that, I still find that really moving. Like it's this burned crust of a face, right? There's this kind of awfulness, right, of what we're seeing. And, but this moment of recognition, it's like, is it really you? And this is something you would say if you hadn't seen somebody for a long time, but seeing somebody you care about here, right? This is clearly a powerful moment for Dante. And the weird thing is he's already shown an ability to be very negative toward those he sees in hell, like we saw Filippo Argenti. But a little further down in hell, where he should be more judgmental, he should be more in line with the divine justice that condemns people to suffer here, he's still moved by pity and love. Is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing?
Yeah, he's going to encounter a few more friends immediately after this, but it's one of the interesting moments just to think of, does Dante only put his enemies into hell?
No.
Is he that kind of writer? And while he does put quite a lot of them in hell, he definitely includes people that he seems to care about as well.
Yeah.
Latini is here as somebody who committed violence against nature, which is to say he was gay or he was a sodomite or however you want to phrase it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that that's also a moment where Dante shows this kind of tenderness where we would pick this
love. He clearly loves his teacher. This is obvious, I think, in this passage.
Yeah, yeah. But that is the vector where a bit of love shows through. I don't know if there's anything particular to take from that observation, but
well, it's just weird that like human love, which I don't see how we're supposed to think that's not good, is in conflict with divine love, the divine love that makes this hell that people suffer in forever.
Right.
Right? This is different from the suffering they'll have in purgatory, where it's suffering to an end. You're going to suffer, but it's going to pay off your sins. It's going to clean your soul, and you'll be in the good place, right? These people are going to suffer forever. There's no out here. And so we're put in this impossible position as readers where human love and divine love are absolutely at odds with one another. So intellectually, we know we're supposed to be on the side of divine love, which punishes, but we can't.
It's also interesting that Dante doesn't particularly go into any detail about the quote-unquote crime that has landed him here.
No.
It's just passed over in silence or alluded to gently.
And he does this weird thing at the very end of the canto, if you remember, where, the Brunetto, they talk together and Brunetto says, I have to go, I can't stay here. So he heads off with the others who are running across the burning sands. And Dante looks after them and he sees the crowd and he sees Brunetto sort of vanishing into the distance. And he says, he seemed to me like the one who wins and not like he who loses. And so it's such a funny moment, a moment of triumph, which really is a moment of abject suffering. It's a very odd moment.
Leaving the seventh circle behind, we reach the eighth circle, which is a massive circle with 10 subdivisions. Mm-hmm. We're now looking at people who've committed the sin of fraud.
Yeah, which you wouldn't think is all that awful. I remember the first time I read the Inferno, I'm like, well, fraud is bad, but is it that bad? But clearly it really is, because it's particularly grotesquely punished down here.
And there are so many different ways to commit fraud.
Clearly. There's a lot of Florentine politics in here.
There's quite a lot of Florentine politics here. This area of fraud is set up in a series of 10 ditches, the Malebolge, the evil ditches.
Evil pockets, I think, literally.
Or pockets, that works as well. We have panderers and seducers, including Jason of the Argonauts. We've got flatterers. We've got simoniacs, which are people who make money off selling ecclesiastic favors or other things like that. We've got sorcerers, including Tiresias.
Which we remember from Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Yeah. We've got barrators, corrupt politicians, and that takes up 2 whole cantos for some reason.
Well, it's politicians. Of course Dante gives it 2 whole cantos because he's so angry. He's so angry.
Yeah, that makes sense. We've got some hypocrites. We've got some thieves, which also goes on for 2. We've got some counselors of fraud. Ulysses is here. This is an interesting one because it's not people who've committed fraud. It's people who've inspired others to commit fraud.
Mm-hmm. Which is even worse. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
To make other people do the bad thing is worse than doing the bad thing.
So because Ulysses told somebody to do the Trojan horse trick amongst other things. He is this deep in hell. Interesting. Also, a bunch of Florentines are by him. So,
Sure.
So it goes. Bulge 9, we've got the Sowers of Discord, which again is subdivided into 3 different groups. People who do religious discord, political discord, and family discord.
Mm-hmm. Again, like that the family level is the worst of the 3, which is kind of interesting, right? You would think, if it's at the level of the whole nation, well, that would be worse. But no, breaking up the family is worse than breaking up a big community. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, or religious discord, which you'd think would be kind of primary.
Yeah. Well, so this is the place where Dante puts Muhammad, so the prophet of Islam, and not just Muhammad, but also Ali, who was Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law and is understood as the head of the branch of Islam, that's Shia Islam. And this is a really weird moment. I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but it's interesting, first of all, that Dante puts Muhammad in hell at all, because he's putting him down there as a schismatic, that is somebody who split up Christianity into a heretical sect. So he's clearly got an understanding of Islam, not as a religion on its own, but as a subset of Christianity, a deviant subset of Christianity. And that, kind of makes sense. That's a view that you occasionally see in the Middle Ages, right, of Islam as an offshoot of Christianity. But the super weird thing is he puts Ali down there, because Ali can be understood by people who are not Shia, can be understood as someone who's creating a schism within Islam. Now, in what universe is creating a schism within Islam heretical? And for Dante, the only way it can make sense is if he's still understanding Muslims as somehow still within the Christian body of believers. So it's a very odd idiosyncratic view. So that's interesting. And then, of course, the other thing that's incredible about that canto, it's Canto 28, is the way in which, remember we've said how like punishments on the bodies reflect the sins of what people have done. Here, this is the place where the suffering ones talk explicitly about this, how this looks, why this looks this way. So Muhammad is split from his mouth down to his anus, right? So his entire digestive tract, and his guts are sort of falling out. And that's meant to be a reflection of how the body of believers, right, was split apart by Islam as seen as a Christian heresy. And then Ali is also split, but not in the middle of his body. His head is split. So the way that Dante depicts Muhammad and Ali in hell reflects not just a very negative view of Islam, but actually one that's based on an unusual grasp of the early history of Islam. So Ali's punishment is to have his head cut in half, which is reflecting not only the way he died, he was attacked in that way, but also the split in the headship or the caliphate within Islam. So it's very nuanced. And then finally, at the end of Canto 28, we see one of the damned telling us about how this system works, and it's a super creepy image, I always think. Do you remember that one?
This is Bertrand de Born.
Yeah, it's so creepy. Don't you think?
It is. So you probably know more about who he was in real life than I do.
Yeah, I mean, he's a poet. He's an incredibly wonderful poet, actually. He's a Provençal poet. And he's down there being punished because he split up a family, and didn't just split up any old family. He split apart Henry II, ruler of England and parts of what are now France, from his son and heir, Henry the Young King. And this is a splitting apart of the family that also affects the whole nation, affects the big political scene. But it's that splitting apart of the family for Dante that is punished so harshly. So that's sort of interesting. But what's really striking is the way that crime of splitting apart father from son is reflected on his body. And Dante is totally creeped out by what he sees. He says, "I saw it. I'm sure I saw it. And I seem to see it still. A body with no head." He held his severed head up by its hair, swinging it in one hand just like a lantern. And as it looked at us, it said, "Alas." Right? That is so creepy. Of his own self, he made himself a light, and they were 2 in 1 and 1 in 2. Right? So he's totally creeped out by what he sees. And then he says, he raised the arm that held the head up high to let it speak to us. It spoke. "Now see the monstrous punishment. You there still breathing, looking at the dead. See if you find suffering to equal mine." And he says, "Because I cut the bonds of those who were joined, father and son, I bear my head cut off from its life source, which is back there within its trunk. In me you see the perfect contrapasso." And that's the very end of that canto. And that word contrapasso is kind of defining this system of punishment that we've been watching all along as we've gone farther and farther down into hell. And now finally we're being told how that works. Your body is a kind of a reflection of what you did. It's very creepy. I find it super creepy.
Yeah, Carson translates contrapasso as counterforce. I illustrate the law of counterforce is how that canto ends for him.
It's hard to translate. I think people always have a hard time with it.
Yeah, which makes the question of whether you leave it in the Italian as a kind of technical term that you're borrowing, or whether you do try to find some other way of phrasing it. An interesting question for the translator.
And so now we're getting into the bowels of hell.
We finally approach the 9th circle, which is all ice.
Mm-hmm. The frozen lake. We've seen rivers all the way down. It's like a hydraulic system. Like all of hell has these rivers running through it. And then we get to the bottom and it's still water, but this time ice, which is weird because when you think about hell, you're expecting like fire, right? When we've seen boiling pitch and all that. And there's this uncanny feeling that when you get to the very bottom, it's still and cold.
And the people are under the frozen lake.
Yeah. Sometimes all the way in, sometimes partly sticking out. And it's hard to know which one is worse, right?
So this is also divided up into subsections. We've got 4 different subsections. These are the traitors, by the way. And we've got traitors to kindred and traitors to country, traitors to guests, and finally, what is the last one? I didn't write that down.
Well, I think it's because it's left a little bit unclear, right? It's called the Judaica, which is also the word for ghetto or place where Jewish people live, right? So it's a kind of a creepy allusion in that last little bit. So what we see there is we finally get to Satan himself, right? Frozen, stuck in the lake that's at the bottom of hell. And he's got 3 faces, and in his 3 mouths, he's got 3 traitors. And 2 of them, Brutus and Cassius, have betrayed Caesar, right? So it's a kind of a political transgression that they're being eternally chomped on to pay for. And Judas is also there, having betrayed Christ, right? So we're seeing kind of the political and also religious systems, right, lined up together here, right? The sort of incredible level of treason. And I remember thinking this was super weird the first time I read it. I'm like, you think Brutus and Cassius are as bad as Judas? Okay. I mean, I guess that's going to make sense. It's not intuitively obvious that they would be on the same level, right?
Yeah.
So it's saying something about how important political order and how bad political treachery is in Dante's vision of the world.
And also how important, so to speak, what we might now call Roman times are. In other words, these are the worst people from Vergil's lifetime. And this is still extremely resonant in Dante's world, even though the Roman Empire has long since disappeared.
Well, it's because he's deeply concerned with the idea of the Republic, right? He's really concerned with what kind of governance should be in place. I mean, this is his passion.
And he's also deeply concerned with this idea of unity. This sort of, he's very pro one world government in some of his other texts.
Yeah.
And so Italy is divided into a bunch of different states and different languages, which Dante, in some of his other works, is deeply concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, we promised we wouldn't talk too much about Florentine politics, but I think when you get into that part of hell, you can't leave Florence entirely aside because this is what he's preoccupied with. He's preoccupied with what form of government should be, what should be the place of the church and the Pope in particular relative to government. What should the world look like in the here and now, which is kind of weird, right? Because this is a poem that's supposed to be about the afterlife, right? It's supposed to be concerned with eternal things, like the big picture, right? After this world. And on the one hand, yeah, Dante is really interested in that, and he's writing about that afterworld, but he's also really concerned with the here and now. What should our world look like? What should our political system be like? How should we live together? He's really interested in this, as much as he's interested in the afterworld, at least in the Inferno.
Yeah, his ideas of how to be a good person, how to be a good state, the importance of unity in all of these ways.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, I've read Dante many times, right? And I still find it hard to fully understand how it is he yokes together his political vision with his sort of theological and devotional commitments. Like he's got them lined up; they're running parallel, right up against each other the whole way through. But it's still kind of puzzling because I think we have a really hard time of thinking about how things should be in the eternal sense and how things should be in the temporal sense, that is, in our lived lives. And Dante just sort of lines them up together and doesn't really flesh out the relationship between those two. Like he kind of leaves it for you to work out how those are lined up. And I think that's why it still continues to be jarring that you've got Brutus and Cassius, being, gnawed on by Satan eternally. And also Judas, because we're accustomed to thinking about Judas as the exemplar of treachery, right? This is the one who betrayed Christ. This is like a singular level of treason, right? Like betraying God, right? Like, woo, right? That's the biggest thing. And also Brutus and Cassius. Like it feels like such a category violation. But Dante is telling us, no, these are on a level with one another. These in the system, these are just the different mouths of Satan. Like, yeah, Judas is in the middle mouth, which I guess is slightly more important, right? But they're all there. But he's not going to tell us why that works that way. It's sort of suspended for us. Like we're left with that, trying to figure that out. The same way that we're left kind of suspended with those 3 beasts. Remember in the opening of the Inferno? Like there are different efforts that are made to kind of interpret what those different wild beasts mean, but they don't really make sense. And that enigmatic quality of the 3 beasts at the beginning, it's a little bit like that enigmatic quality you were left with at the end, I think. And also the other, problem that we've gone all the way down to the very bottom of hell. And now how are we going to get out?
So how they get out is they start climbing down Satan's fur.
And Dante is totally puzzled by this because he's got hairy legs.
It's such a weird passage. They go all the way down. They reach his genitals.
Well, yeah, because remember, Vergil puts Dante on his back. He's like, just hang on to me and we'll be fine. And Dante's like, okay.
And they climb on his body, on Satan's body, all grabbing onto tufts of hair and working down with apparently Satan not noticing, which fair enough. He's much bigger.
He's busy.
He's busy chewing. And they go down, they get all the way to his genitals, and that is where they pass the center of the universe.
Yeah.
And so they start climbing upwards.
Going down his legs, upwards.
Yeah. And eventually they pop out in the southern hemisphere.
Over by Australia, which they don't know about.
Yeah. They don't know anything about it. They think she used to be covered by land, but when Satan landed in hell, basically all the land sort of cinched up and became a mountain, which is now purgatory. And that's a story for another time.
To be continued.
But they emerge into that on Easter Sunday. So I was in New York recently, and I went with some friends and family to the Met. And one of the statues that they have at the Met, which is very striking, is based on a passage that comes towards the end of the Inferno. It's a passage of Ugolino and his sons and grandchildren.
I didn't know that. That's so cool.
Oh, it's a really striking one. That passage is one of the most haunting and remarkable passages in the book.
Especially because it's a moment, we've been talking about Dante's response to the suffering he sees. These people in hell deserve to be there, right? They're evil. They're suffering for what they did. And sometimes Dante responds in a way that agrees with that condemnation. Other times it's kind of pushing back, like when he sees Brunetto Latini and he's like moved by love for his former teacher. This passage, where we see Ugolino, Dante's response might not be problematic, but our response is hard to process.
So this takes place in the ninth circle of hell, and it's under the category of people who were traitors to their country.
So these are bodies that are frozen in the ice. And Dante at first is not quite sure what he's seeing, like in the same way that we've seen happen a little bit earlier in the Inferno, where he's kind of puzzled by what he's looking at. And Dante says, this is right near the end of Canto 32. He said, I saw two souls frozen together in a single hole, so that one head used the other for a cap. As a man with hungry teeth tears into bread, the soul with capping head had sunk his teeth into the other's neck just below the skull. So this is creepy enough already. But as we get into Canto 33, so we're getting further down, the two of this pair, one of them will speak to Dante. It's a little bit like when we were in the Circle of Lust, when Francesco spoke to Dante, but Paolo didn't speak. We're going to only hear one of the two speak. So, lifting his mouth from his horrendous meal, the sinner first wiped off his messy lips in the hair remaining on the chewed-up skull, and spoke. And so he tells his story. He says, when I awoke before the light of dawn, I heard my children sobbing in their sleep. You see, they too were there in the tower, asking for bread. If the thought of what my heart was telling me does not fill you with grief, how cruel you are. If you're not weeping now, do you ever weep? And then they awoke. It was about the time they usually brought our food to us. But now each one of us was full of dread from dreaming. Then from below I heard them driving nails into the dreadful tower's door, and with that I stared in silence at my flesh and blood. So Ugolino is here in the tower with his sons. Right? He says, I did not weep. I turned to stone inside. They wept, and my little Anselmuccio spoke. What is it, father? Why do you look that way? I bit my hands in anguish, and my children, who thought that hunger made me bite my hands, were quick to draw up closer to me, saying, Oh, father, you would make us suffer less if you would feed on us. You were the one who gave us this sad flesh. You take it from us. The fourth day came, and it was on that day my Gatto fell prostrate before my feet, crying, Why don't you help me? Why, my father? There he died. Just as you see me here, I saw the other three fall, one by one, as the fifth day and the sixth day passed, and I, by then gone blind, groped over their dead bodies. Though they were dead 2 days, I called their names. Then hunger proved more powerful than grief. And that's the last thing he says, right? And that passage is a real roller coaster emotionally, I have to say. It's horrible, and you feel bad, and then you get to the end, and you're like, wait, what?
Yeah, it's incredibly visceral.
Oh, man.
And it's so hard to read this passage without putting yourself in his shoes.
Yeah.
Or in any of their shoes, trapped. I suppose. Yeah, to be trapped, to be in this terrible situation, to be, driven mad by hunger.
And by watching your children starve.
Yeah.
I mean, how? Ugh.
Exactly.
So we feel bad, right? Problem, right?
Right. Ugolino is thrown into into the jail because of political machinations, which we don't hear very much about.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have any sense of the context of whether that was a just thing or not.
How much suffering he caused. We have no sense of that. We
Right.
only have a sense of his suffering, right? His story.
How does Dante respond to this story?
It's pretty neutral, though a little bit later in that same circle of hell, he will be really mean to one of the souls. One of the souls will say, the frozen rain is coming down upon me, and like his eyes are frozen shut. The water is pooled in his eyes, and he wants Dante to clear it away. And Dante says, well, tell me your story. And then the soul down there tells Dante his story, and then Dante refuses to clear away the ice. And Vergil's like, good job, Dante.
Oh, man.
Because he's become one of the devils almost, right? He's become one of those who torment the suffering in hell. Dante's doing it right. And we're like, so not there.
Yeah,
we are
indeed.
so not there.
Exactly. And when you did that first quote, you broke off a little bit early because we are primed a bit for this terrible visceral scene that's about to happen by the description of what is going on. Here's the Carson translation. I saw these two packed so into one hole that this one's head served as the other's hat, though slightly skew. So a bit of comedy there. And like a starving man devouring bread, the upper chewed the nape of him below. On bits of brain and spinal cord he fed, like Tydeus, who in his dying throe of rage enjoyed the skull of Menelaus, attacking his brow and other bits with gusto. So we've also got this classical allusion to another terrible story of cannibalism. But then, of course, this is an even worse story, both because you're seeing these children dying, and then you're also seeing Ugolino reduced to eating.
Though it's never explicit, and which makes it, of course, that much more creepy, right?
I mean,
because
it's blatant.
People do read that line other ways. Hunger proved more powerful than grief. It can mean one of two things, right? It can mean hunger proved more powerful than grief, so I finally died, right? Sometimes people read it that way. Or hunger proved more powerful than grief, like I ate the bodies, right? And it doesn't. So I think it's really important that he does that, right? He leaves you like, what? I mean, that's it's like a horror movie, right? When you see the killing, it's like not nearly as scary as when you kind of don't.
Yeah, I have a difficult time with that other interpretation that it could possibly mean anything other than that he ate them. But
yeah, I think he ate them. I do.
I think intentionally he doesn't say it. Like, it's hard to imagine Ugolino admitting to it. He doesn't want to verbalize it.
No, he's telling his own story. In the same way, again, Francesca, right? Francesca's telling the story the way it looks to her. It's the version that makes them come off best. And so Ugolino, too, is going to tell the version of the story that makes you feel bad, right?
Well, we said a lot about this text, and I'm sure we could say many, many, many more.
We could talk about it all semester long.
We could, indeed. But before we head off, I wanted to bring up one other text that is more recent. It's from about 10, 15 years ago, but engages with Dante's text and with translations of it in a really interesting way. There's a poet named Caroline Bergvall who wrote a poem called Via. The idea behind the text is quite simple. It takes all of the English translations of the Inferno, so 47 or 48 of them, depending on the version, and gives you the first tercet in alphabetical order.
Yeah, and when you shared this with me, I was like, this is so cool. It's like, what she does, which, again, I find this so beautiful. She gives us the Italian text, right? In the middle of the path of our life, I found myself in an obscure, dark woods where the right way was lost. Or obscured, right? Or is that impossible to see? And so she puts that out there like in this really stark kind of way. And then we get this version and this version and this version and this version. It's like seemingly repetitive, only it's not at all. Like, so the light is refracted into like a bajillion different images kind of. And I found that really absolutely captivating.
We'll have a link to a recording of the poet reading this text. The text itself is not really available online, so we probably won't be able to link to that, but we'll link to the book that it is included in, which is a pretty great book and totally worth checking out. So next time we are going to be looking at Paradise Lost.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, Milton's totally, totally different from Dante. Like, he's not going to be absorbed with pagan antiquity, with Greco-Roman literature in the same way that Dante is. Like, he will also be really interested, especially in Latin literature, but in a different way from Dante. He's going to be absorbed in the Hebrew Bible. And I don't just mean the Old Testament, I mean the Hebrew Bible specifically, in ways that, again, would be unfamiliar to Dante. But he clearly knows the Divine Comedy and is really interested in its way of engaging. And in particular, again, with the idea of I guess you could say the moral ambiguity of evil, right? It's a sort of famous thing to say. The most admirable character in Paradise Lost is Satan. That's a problem.
Well, I'm looking forward to revisiting Paradise Lost, but in the meanwhile, if any listeners want to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at @thespouter. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/7, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time,
Until next time, we'll look forward to seeing you again at the Spouter-Inn.